In the middle of the Kalahari, a 62-year-old man who once guided trophy hunters slid his arm under a rusted loading ramp to save two starving lion cubs. He expected pleading eyes. Instead, he met teeth, claws, and a look that hated humankind. He had no idea that single moment would drag him into a years-long journey of redemption, from a makeshift field clinic to a gate opened onto the wild, and end on a lonely dirt road where two fully grown lions would one day step out, block his truck, and stare straight into the face of the man who almost lost everything to a single gunshot long ago. The radio crackled to life just after dawn, when the desert air was still cold enough to make Ethan Cole's fingers ache around his coffee mug. He was halfway through the last swallow when the call came in, a thin voice threaded with static and worry. A local cattle herder, speaking hurried Setswana and broken English, said there were strange sounds near an old stockyard at the edge of his grazing land, close to a hunting camp that nobody used anymore. Something was dead there, he said, and the hyenas had started to circle. Ethan set the mug down, listening in that quiet, intent way you develop when you've spent too many nights with only a radio between you and real trouble. Most folks his age, he thought absently, were back in the States worrying about retirement planning, life insurance, or whether their home security system actually worked. His own portfolio was a pair of worn boots, a field pack, and the creaking Toyota parked under the acacia outside. Cabello stepped into the little office just as the call ended, shrugging on his jacket. The younger ranger moved with the loose-limbed ease of someone whose knees still cooperated. "Problem?" he asked. "Maybe," Ethan said. "Herder up north says something's dead by the old stockyard near Motswana's hunting camp. Hyenas, strange noises, bad smell. Sounds like we should take a look." Cabello wrinkled his nose as if he could already smell it. "If it's just a dead cow, the hyenas can have it. But if there's poison—" "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "If there's poison, we've got more than hyenas to worry about." They checked the first aid kit, tossed a couple of blankets, a pair of heavy gloves, and a coil of rope into the back of the truck. Ethan slipped the radio onto his belt, the black plastic warm from the charger. In another life, he'd worn a different kind of equipment: rifle, binoculars, a smile for rich clients who spent more on one luxury safari than most families saved for college tuition or health insurance over a decade. Attorneys, doctors, even a talkative personal injury lawyer or two had sat in his truck over the years, bragging that one good case could take care of their Medicare. Care premiums forever, he shook the memory off as he climbed into the driver's seat. The sun was just beginning to push a pale line over the horizon, turning the low bushes silver. Out here in this dry corner of the Kalahari, daylight came quickly. The truck coughed, then settled into a steady growl as they rolled out of the station compound and followed the dirt track north. The road narrowed into two faint ruts between golden grass and patches of bare red earth. Guinea fowl scattered ahead of the truck in little explosions of wings, their calls sharp in the clear morning. Ethan drove with the careful attention of a man who knew every hidden dip and washout, his hands light on the wheel, shoulders stiff only when the track veered toward familiar ground. He hadn't been back to that old hunting camp in years. The name of it still sat like a stone in his chest. People paid good money once to sit on that veranda at sunset and drink cold beer, talking about stocks and bonds, retirement savings, or which car insurance company offered the best discount for new SUVs. All the while, the trophies on the wall stared down with glass eyes, and someone like Ethan smiled politely and lined up the next once-in-a-lifetime shot. Now the camp was empty. The clients were gone. But the land, he knew, never really forgot. They spotted the herder's cattle first, a scattered line of brown and white shapes grazing nervously a few hundred yards from the old stockyard. The man himself waited near a mopine tree, wrapped in a faded jacket, hat pulled low to shield his eyes. He waved them over, relief obvious in the way his shoulders dropped when the truck rolled to a stop. "It smells bad," he said, pointing toward the sagging fence and the gray shapes beyond. "The hyenas came in the night, and something cries under the ramp. I don't go close." "You did the right thing calling," Ethan told him. His voice was steady, the way you spoke to someone who'd already seen enough hard things. "Stay back with Cabello. I'll take a look." The stockyard looked smaller than he remembered, the wooden posts leaning at odd angles, wire rusted and broken. An old loading ramp of thick steel plate jutted from one side, the paint long since peeled away, leaving it the color of dried blood and dust. The air around it had the heavy, sweet, sour weight of rot that made the back of his throat prickle. He walked slowly, breathing through his mouth, eyes taking in the trampled ground, the drag marks, the prints in the dust. Hyenas for sure. Vultures, too, somewhere close, though they were not in view just yet. A dark hump lay in the open, what was left of a cow, hide and bone, and the suggestion of meat. Flies lifted in a cloud when he stepped near, then settled again. Under the loading ramp it was darker, the metal casting a shallow cave of shadow, cool compared to the rising heat outside. From that darkness came a sound that didn't belong to hyenas or cattle. A ragged, low, rasping noise, thin but fierce, like someone trying to turn a growl into something bigger than their small lungs could manage. Ethan dropped to one knee, ignoring the protest from his joints. The dust was fine as flour, puffing under his weight. He slipped on the heavy gloves, their leather cracked and soft from years of use, and leaned down until his face was almost level with the edge of the ramp. "Easy there," he murmured. "Let's see what we've got." At first he could only make out shapes. Two, he thought, pressed against the far corner, just beyond the reach of the light. Eyes caught the faint reflection, twin flecks of pale amber. One pair, then another. The smell here was sharper, not just of rot, but of fear and something sour under the skin. He eased his gloved hand forward, palm open, fingers flat. For a moment, nothing moved. The sound stopped. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Then the darkness exploded. A small body slammed into his hand so hard it jarred his shoulder, teeth sinking through leather with a ferocity that belonged on an animal 10 times the size. Another set of claws raked across his wrist, hooking fabric, trying to drag his arm deeper into the narrow space. A high, raw snarl ripped out, not the frightened cry he'd half expected, but a sound full of rage, like hatred boiled down into something thin and sharp. "Whoa," Ethan gasped, more in surprise than pain. He didn't yank his hand back, though every instinct screamed at him to. He held where he was, muscles burning as the tiny jaws worried his glove, shaking it as if they could tear him apart with sheer will. Cabello shouted something behind him, boots crunching closer. "Ethan, get your hand out of there." "It's all right," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "They're cubs." He could feel it now, the smallness of the jaw, the fine bones under the fur that pressed against his skin through the torn glove. Lion cubs, no more than a few months old, but already learning what the world had to offer them. No comfort, no gentle hands. Just pain and hunger and the smell of death by the ramp where their mother had likely fallen. The one clamped on his hand growled again, a hoarse, determined sound. The other swatted at his forearm, claws snagging the fabric, little body trembling with effort and fury. Ethan's chest tightened, a different kind of ache working its way up behind his ribs. He had reached out expecting fear, maybe a desperate, clinging kind of trust. Instead, their answer was pure defiance, as if every bad thing people had ever done to lions had been distilled and poured into these two small bodies crouched in the dark. Their response shattered his heart in a way no bullet, no accident, no long-ago mistake ever had. He swallowed, forcing his voice to remain low, steady, the way you might talk to a skittish old horse or a grandchild waking from a nightmare. "All right, little ones," he whispered, letting them bite and claw, refusing to pull away. "I hear you. You've got every right to be mad. But I'm not leaving you under here to die." Behind him, the desert wind slid over the rusted metal and broken boards, carrying the distant laugh of hyenas somewhere beyond the fence. Ethan stayed where he was, arm buried in shadow, hand caught in those tiny, furious jaws, knowing this was only the beginning of a long road, and that for the first time in a very long life he wasn't here to take anything from a lion. He was here to give something back. By the time Ethan eased his arm back out from under the ramp, his glove was shredded and his forearm stung in half a dozen places. The cub finally released him with a last furious shake, teeth scraping against leather before it retreated into the dark. He sat back on his heels for a moment, letting his breath settle, feeling the hot thrum of his pulse in his fingers. "They're lying, all right," he said quietly, "and they're not in the mood to make friends." Cabello hovered just behind his shoulder, rifle slung but not quite resting easy. "You sure you're okay, old man?" "I've been bitten by worse things," Ethan muttered. "Twice by my ex-wife's poodle, remember? These two at least have a good reason." He pushed himself to his feet, knees popping, and brushed the dust from his pants. The smell of rot rolled over him again, thicker now that the sun was higher. He turned away from the ramp, following the drag marks in the dirt toward the open patch where the carcass lay. Up close, it was uglier. The cow had been dead for days, hide pulled tight over the bones like old canvas, belly torn open by scavengers. Flies rose in a shimmering cloud and settled again. Ethan squinted down, not just at the body, but at the ground around it. There were paw prints, hyena tracks, a few faint lion pads, all overlapping. And there, near the shoulder, under a smear of dried blood, he saw what he'd been half expecting and fully dreading. Tiny, pale granules caught in the cracks of the earth, clinging to the edge of flesh that hadn't quite been eaten clean. He crouched, ignoring the protest in his back, and scraped a bit of the powder onto his fingertip. He didn't need a lab to tell him what it was. Behind him, the herder shuffled closer, hand pressed over his nose and mouth. "Bad?" the man asked. "Bad," Ethan said. "You didn't put this here?" The herder shook his head sharply. "No, no. My cattle come, they graze, they drink. I find the cow like this. Hyena's already here. I don't use poison. Too dangerous. No insurance will pay if they find poison, and I don't want trouble with the government." Ethan believed him. Men who used poison usually didn't call rangers for help. They called someone in a suit later, maybe a corporate lawyer, when the fines and the lawsuits started piling up, and they needed a personal injury attorney to argue that they didn't know. He stood slowly, wiped his fingers on the dead cow's hide, then on his own pant leg. "Someone laid bait," he said, more to himself than to the others. "Cow, probably. Died somewhere else, got dragged here. They dust the meat, so anything that feeds on it gets a dose. Hyenas, vultures, lions, anything." Cabello swore softly under his breath. "Same trick as before," he said. "Those big cattlemen, they always say the same thing. Lions cost me money. Nobody pays me for dead cows. This is cheap for them. Cheaper than good fences. Cheaper than better grazing land. And more expensive than they realize," Ethan replied. "Once lawyers and fines get involved, those poison baits can cost more than a mortgage." The younger man cast a nervous glance back at the ramp. "If the mother lion fed on this, then she got a full dose," Ethan finished. "And those two under there probably got whatever was left in her milk or off the carcass when she brought them here. That would explain the smell, the crying the herder heard. She might have dragged herself close to shelter, trying to hide them, and never made it." His throat tightened. He'd seen it before, years back. Different ranch, different country, same sick pattern. A lioness stretched out near a poisoned cow, paws stiff, eyes filmed over to a dull, cloudy amber that no longer saw anything at all. In his mind, without wanting to, he saw another scene, layered over this one. A neat wooden deck, fresh paint, cold beer sweating in green bottles as a man from Houston laughed too loud about how his financial advisor had him set for retirement. "I've got life insurance, long-term care, even a trust for the grandkids," the client had boasted, patting his belly. "All I need now is a big lion on my wall." Ethan had smiled then because that was what he was paid to do. He pointed out tracks, calculated wind, lined up the shot so the man didn't have to think too hard. When the lion went down in a cloud of dust and pride, they'd all cheered. Later, after the pictures and the high fives, he'd walked alone to the far side of the property, where a skinny lioness, ribs showing, picked at a poisoned carcass someone had dumped to thin the predators. He'd watched her for a long time, torn between warning her and knowing it was already too late. The next morning they'd found her by the riverbank, swollen tongue lolling, paws dug into the sand where she'd tried to claw her way out of the burning in her gut. He hadn't slept right since. Now, standing over this dead cow, Ethan felt that same chill run through him despite the rising heat. He scanned the scrub around the stockyard, eyes searching for any sign of a larger body, a tuft of tawny fur, vultures perched in a patient circle. Nothing, just dust, thorn trees, and the old camp crouched behind them like a guilty shadow. "We have to call Lena," he said at last. "Those cubs might already have poison working through them. They're small, but tough. Sometimes you get a window where you can pull the toxins out, help the liver catch up. We don't have a proper hospital, but she can do more there than we can under this ramp." Cabello nodded, already reaching for his radio. "You think they'll make it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. The honest part of him wanted to say no. Poison was an ugly thing. It didn't always kill fast, but it almost always killed hard. He'd seen strong lions crumble, vultures dropping from trees, even wild dogs staggering like drunk men before they fell. But he remembered the feel of those small jaws on his hand, the way the cub had thrown its whole weight into the bite, as if it refused to give up even 1 inch without a fight. He thought of people back home arguing with health insurance companies over chemo bills and hospital stays, clinging to slim chances because slim was still better than none. "They're fighters," he said finally. "If anyone can give them a shot, it's Lena." The drive back to the station felt longer, though it was only an hour. Ethan sat quieter than usual, watching the land roll by, low hills, thorny bushes, a line of acacias tracing an invisible riverbed. Every so often he caught a glimpse of the old hunting camp's roof through the scrub, rusted metal flashing dull in the sun. He remembered other drives from that place, trucks loaded with grinning men and their trophies, horns and hides, and bragging rights. Back then, when someone asked what he did for a living, he'd say, "I help people fulfill their dreams." It sounded nice on a plane, talking to strangers comparing credit card rewards and travel insurance policies. He never mentioned the part where someone else's dream meant the end of a life that never asked to be part of anybody's bucket list. When they rolled through the gate of the station, dust trailing behind them, Lena was already waiting in the yard. She stood beside the small clinic building, dark hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, a notebook tucked under one arm. Her truck was still humming, the hood hot from a fast drive. "You found them?" she called out as soon as Ethan stepped down from the cab. "We did," he said. He pulled off the ruined glove, held it up so she could see the punctures. "They're under the old loading ramp by Motswana's camp. 2 cubs, mean as sin. And there's a poisoned carcass not 20 yards away." Lena's eyes narrowed. "Bait? Looks like it," he replied. "Same old story. Someone didn't want to deal with predators the hard way." She exhaled slowly, the line between her brows deepening. "If they're secondarily poisoned, we're on the clock. We'll need fluids, charcoal, maybe antidotes if we can figure out what compound they used, and we'll have to move them. They won't survive a day under that ramp with hyenas sniffing around." Cabello leaned against the truck, watching them both. "You really think we can save them?" Lena glanced toward the horizon, where the heat was starting to shimmer above the earth. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know what happens if we don't try." Ethan looked down at his hand, at the crescent marks already darkening under his skin. The cubs hadn't just bitten, they'd answered a question he hadn't realized he was asking. After all the years of guiding rich men to their trophies, of walking on poisoned ground and pretending he didn't see the cost, this felt like the first honest fight he'd been invited into. "Tell me what you need," he said to Lena. "Supplies, stretchers, whatever. I'll go back under that ramp as many times as it takes." She gave him a long, searching look, as if measuring something in his face that had nothing to do with age or experience. Then she nodded once. "All right, Ethan," she said. "Let's see if we can pull 2 little lions back from the edge, and maybe, just maybe, pull a few pieces of this place's soul back with them." He didn't say it out loud, but as he turned toward the shed to gather ropes and blankets, he knew she wasn't just talking about the Kalahari. She was talking about him, too. By late afternoon, the old stockyard lay under a hard white sky, the kind that bleached color out of everything and made the air feel thin. Ethan and Lena had been back and forth between the station and the ramp twice already, hauling what she said they needed: 2 heavy plastic crates with holes drilled in the sides, blankets, jugs of water, a portable IV stand, and a battered metal case full of bottles and syringes. The herder had taken his cattle farther away. Even the hyenas kept their distance now, wary of the human voices and the smell of antiseptic. Only the vultures circled high overhead, dark commas written against the bright light. "They still under there?" Lena asked, squinting toward the shadow beneath the ramp. Ethan nodded. "Haven't come out. They quieted down some, but when I tried to get close a couple hours ago, I still got that growl." He flexed his fingers in a fresh pair of gloves. The skin beneath them looked like a road map: old scars, new teeth marks, sunspots. Sometimes he wondered what a life insurance underwriter would make of his hands alone. Probably a higher premium than most folks his age, the ones who'd stuck with office jobs, steady paychecks, retirement savings accounts, and health insurance plans that made sense on paper. "Here's the situation," Lena said, dragging him back to the present. "We need to get those cubs out from under there and into the crates without breaking them mentally or physically. Once we've got them back at the clinic, I can start fluids, charcoal, maybe an antidote if I can figure out the compound. But they're already stressed. If we rush them, we'll finish what the poison started." "So you want me to sweet-talk them," Ethan said. "I want you to do whatever you did this morning that ended with you still having all your fingers," she replied. "You've got the voice they're starting to recognize, Cabello, and I will hang back unless you yell. If a hyena shows up or something worse, we'll be there in a heartbeat." Cabello grunted. "You go under that ramp again, old man, and I'll be right here with the rifle, but don't expect me to pull you back by your feet. You go too far, they can keep you." "That's comforting," Ethan said dryly. They set up a little camp a few yards away, Lena's medical gear laid out on a tarp, the crates positioned so they could slide cubs in quickly once they were out. A small lantern waited for nightfall. Ethan shrugged off his old canvas jacket and tossed it near the edge of the ramp, letting the fabric pile there. "Leave that?" Lena asked. "Let them get used to the smell," he said. "Smells like me, sweat and bad coffee and old age. Might as well start associating me with something that isn't just pain." He knelt down again, one knee protesting, dust puffing around him. The air felt different now, still carrying the sweet, heavy note of decay, but layered with his own sweat. The sharp tang of alcohol wipes from Lena's kit, the faint diesel from the trucks. The sun had begun to drop, throwing longer shadows, making the world under the ramp even darker. "Hey there," he said softly, leaning close. "It's me again. The idiot with the chewable gloves." For a moment he heard nothing but the faint buzz of flies and the distant rattle of a bird somewhere in the thorn trees. Then came the rasp of breath, the scrape of small bodies shifting in the dust, and that low, warning rumble he was starting to recognize as their language. He slid his gloved hand forward, palm down, fingers relaxed. Not too fast, not too hesitant. Just a slow, steady movement. The growl deepened, then stuttered as if the throat that made it was dry. Something slapped at his knuckles, a paw, lighter than it wanted to be. Claws scratched leather, testing. "It's all right," Ethan murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you. I know that's what people do most of the time. People and poison and loud noises from far away. But not today." Behind him he sensed Lena and Cabello backing even farther off, giving him space. The edge of the world narrowed to the strip of light under the ramp and the unseen shapes beyond it. He took the metal cap from a water bottle with his free hand, filled it, and nudged it carefully forward alongside his arm. A few drops sloshed over, darkening the dust. The scent of water seemed to change the air itself. He heard a soft huff, then a sniff. One of the cubs moved closer. He could feel the faint stir of breath near his wrist. The growl came again, but shorter, undecided. "Go on, sweetheart," he whispered. "You've got to drink. That stuff in your belly is trying to kill you. Let's give your body a fighting chance." There was a pause, then the lightest touch against his fingers. A nose, cold and damp, bumping the glove. Then, suddenly, a weight settled on his forearm. A small paw, claws, hooked just enough to anchor. The cub leaned over it, tongue rasping at the water in the cap. The contact sent a shock through him that had nothing to do with pain. It was like having one of his grandkids reach for his hand in a crowded store years ago, before his marriage went sour and his path bent toward Africa instead of family gatherings and Medicare paperwork and talk of mortgages being paid off. This was trust in its most fragile form, hesitant, temporary, but real in the way it made his throat ache. "There you go," he said, keeping his arm absolutely still. "That's it. Drink up. I've got more where that came from." The cub drank greedily, then coughed, a tiny, harsh sound. Something else moved behind it, probably the sibling, letting out a low, offended growl as it bumped into the first one. There was a brief skirmish of elbows and paws. The water cap tipped, spilled, and the cold nose retreated. Without moving his arm, Ethan refilled the cap, slid it forward again. This time, both sets of breath hovered close. Tiny teeth grazed his glove once, a warning nip. Then one of them gave in to thirst again. Time stretched. The sun dropped lower, the sky shifting from white to gold to bruised purple along the horizon. Shadows from the fence posts reached long and thin. Somewhere behind him, Cabello lit the lantern and set it on low, its glow just enough to keep them from stumbling in the dark. Ethan lost track of how many times he refilled the cap, how many minutes passed with that small paw resting on his arm like an anchor. The cub's weight was almost nothing, but the meaning of it settled heavier and heavier in his chest. "You know," he murmured, half to them, half to the quiet gathering around them, "I used to bring men out here to shoot your kind. Rich fellows, fly in from New York or Dallas, talk about investment portfolios and annuities and which tax attorney they trusted. They'd sit on that veranda over there and ask me about the best travel insurance for their next big trip, as if the only risk in the world was a delayed flight." He felt the paw twitch, claws flexing lightly, as if the cub were dream-walking over his skin. "They never asked what it cost you," he went on softly, "what it cost your mothers, your brothers. They never saw the ones that crawled off under a bush and didn't get back up. I saw them, though. I saw every one." His voice shook. He cleared his throat, but did not pull his hand back. "I can't change those days," he said. "There's no policy to write, no refund, no apology letter that fixes it. All I've got is what's in front of me now. You, the two of you. If you make it out of this, if Lena can pull that poison out of you, maybe I'll sleep a little easier before they put me in the ground." Behind him, Lena shifted, but she didn't speak. The only answer was the slow, rough sound of the cub's breathing and the occasional rattle of a far-off hyena. Call, thinner, now that full dark was creeping in. At some point, the cub's paw slid from his arm. The weight disappeared. There was the rustle of small bodies turning in the dust. Ethan withdrew his hand a few inches, giving them space, then left it resting near the edge of the shadow, palm up. Minutes later, something nudged his fingers. Not biting, not clawing, just a cautious, testing touch. Then, incredibly, he felt a small head press down, using his hand as a pillow. He didn't dare look back to see Lena's face. He just stared into the darkness, blinking hard, letting the tears burn without falling. "We'll sit here a while then," he whispered. "You sleep if you can. Tomorrow, we try moving you. Tomorrow, we start the real fight." The stars came out one by one above the broken posts and rusted metal, old light traveling across years to spill over this small, tired scene. Ethan stayed where he was, arm half under the ramp, legs going numb, back aching. At his age, he knew he'd pay for it in the morning. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the kind of pain that came with purpose, not regret. And somewhere in the quiet space between his heartbeat and the cub's fragile breaths, he understood that this night, this stubborn, uncomfortable, patient night, might be the closest thing to redemption he was ever going to get. Morning came in thin gray stripes through the clinic windows, the kind of light that made everything look tired before the day had even properly started. Ethan felt like he'd never really left the ground by that ramp. His knees ached, his lower back throbbed, and his right hand was stiff where the cub's teeth had found skin through torn leather. But the memory he carried in with him made the pain bearable. That small head resting in his palm for just a few minutes before dawn, as if the cub had finally run out of anger and had nothing left but exhaustion. "They drank," he told Lena, who was already pulling on clean gloves, coffee forgotten on the counter. "Not much, but some, and one of them used my hand for a pillow." "That's better than a chew toy," she said. The corners of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "We'll need that trust now." Getting them out from under the ramp had taken the rest of the night and the last of everyone's nerves. Lena had used a mild sedative dart, just enough to slow their reactions. Ethan had gone back under with his jacket and his voice, easing them toward the crate doors one careful inch at a time. They'd fought even while their eyelids drooped, snarling hoarsely, paws striking at shadows. Now at the station, they lay on 2 thick blankets in the clinic, each cub tucked inside a crate with the door open, bodies half in, half out, as if ready to run even in sleep. A portable heater hummed softly between them, battling the early desert chill. Lena moved from one to the other, listening to their hearts with an old stethoscope, checking. Gums, pressing fingers lightly into their bellies. She'd clipped a small catheter into the leg of the larger cub, taped down with gentle hands. Clear fluid from an IV bag dripped through the line, slow and steady. "Dehydrated," she muttered. Gums pale, heart rate too fast, but that might just be stress. "We're going to start with fluids and charcoal, flush as much as we can." "What about antidotes?" Ethan assessed. She glanced at the shelves where glass vials stood in neat rows, labels in tiny print. "Depends what was used. Some of those agricultural pesticides have very specific treatments. Some don't. And some, if you get it wrong, you make things worse. I've already radioed Dr. Delamini. He's dealt with more of these cases than I have. He's on his way." Ethan nodded, though the words blurred in his mind. He'd never envied people who had to wrestle with complicated medical decisions. In his own family back in the States, when his brother got sick, there'd been a stack of hospital bills, arguments with the health insurance company, talk of long-term care and Medicare supplements, and whether to refinance the house to cover what the policies wouldn't. With animals, there was no life insurance payout, no policy to fight over. Just the simple, brutal math of time, toxins, and whatever skill a tired vet could bring to bear. The door creaked open and a tall man stepped in, dust on his boots, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His hair was cropped close, his face lined in the way of someone who'd spent many years squinting against the sun and bad news. "Sibusiso Dlamini," he said, offering a brief nod. "Call me Cebu. You must be Ethan." "That's me," Ethan replied. "Wish we were meeting over coffee instead of poison." Cebu snorted softly. "Poison has become my coffee." He went straight to the cubs, eyes narrowing in professional focus. "Tell me what you saw at the site." While Ethan talked about the dead cow, the pale granules in the dirt, the drag marks, the ramp, the hyenas. Cebu examined each cub in turn. He lifted eyelids, sniffed their breath, pressed a thumb gently into their gums. "Secondary exposure, most likely," he said at last. "If they fed on their mother or the cow, they may have taken in smaller doses over time. That's bad for liver and kidneys, worse for nerves. We treat symptoms, support the body, use charcoal to bind what's left. Some of these compounds behave like nerve gas in slow motion." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And if we do nothing?" "They die," Cebu said simply. "Slowly, badly. I've seen it." "And if we do everything?" The doctor exhaled, a sound that carried both fatigue and blunt honesty. "Maybe they live. Maybe they live with damage. Maybe they don't make it despite our best efforts. This is not an intensive care unit in a big city hospital, Mr. Cole. We don't have ventilators and constant monitoring and a legal department, worrying about malpractice insurance. We have rudimentary tools in a small clinic with a generator that likes to argue." As if summoned by the words, a low rumble shook the windows. The overhead light flickered, buzzed, then steadied again. "Storm!" Cabello called from the doorway. "West Side's already getting wind. Clouds coming in fast." Lena glanced at the power strip, then at the small fridge that held some of their more delicate drugs. "Of course," she murmured. "Why wouldn't we have a power cut on top of everything?" Outside, the first gust hit, slamming dust against the building in a dry hiss. Ethan could hear something metal clatter in the yard, the distant creak of the station's windmill. "Let's start what we can start," Cebu said briskly. "Fluids for both. Charcoal slurry, slow and steady. We watch their hearts, their breathing. If they seize, we have something for that. If they stop, we try to bring them back." The hours that followed melted into a blur of small tasks and larger fears. Ethan held the cubs' heads while Lena syringed the thick black charcoal into their mouths, a drop at a time, wiping away what spilled. Cebu adjusted IV drip rates, checked pulses, muttered to himself in Zulu and English. Outside, the wind picked up until it sounded like the whole desert was scraping its nails down the walls. The lights flickered again, went out for a full 5 seconds, then snapped back on with a click that made Ethan's heart jump. At one point, the little lioness, Lena had quietly called her Nala now, more to have something to say than to christen her in any official way, jerked, her muscles tightening in a wave that rolled from her shoulders to her hind legs. Her mouth opened in a soundless yelp, eyes rolling white for a fraction of a second. "Seizure," Cebu said sharply. He was at her side in 2 strides, a syringe already in his hand. "Hold her head." Ethan slid his hands around Nala's skull, feeling the wild, uncontrolled tremor under his palms. For one terrible moment, she felt less like a cub and more like a live wire. The storm outside crashed on, dust tapping at the windows like impatient fingers. Cebu injected the medicine into the IV line, watched the vein, watched the chest. The seizure peaked, then began to ebb, leaving Nala limp and panting, her tongue lolling to one side. "Come on, girl," Ethan whispered, bent so close he could feel her breath against his cheek. "You fought me under that ramp like you meant it. Don't you quit now." Her chest hitched, then stuttered. For a second, Ethan couldn't tell if she was breathing at all. "Is she—" "Not yet," Cebu interrupted. The doctor's calm had a thin edge now. "But listen to me, both of you." He looked from Ethan to Lena. "If after 24 hours there is no improvement, if the seizures worsen, if they slip into constant distress, we have to consider euthanasia. I will not drag them through. Days of pain just to soothe our guilt." The word hung in the air like another kind of threat. Ethan felt something hot rise in his chest, hotter than the wind, hotter than the anger he'd aimed at himself for years. "You're talking about putting them down." "I am talking about mercy," Cebu replied quietly. "Mercy when hope is gone. We are not there yet. But I want you to understand the line we may have to draw." Lena's gaze flicked to Ethan's face. She saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands tightened around Nala's head even after the tremors stopped. "Let's get through this night before we decide anything," she said softly. "One step at a time." The storm raged on. The generator coughed once, twice, then steadied. The little fridge kept humming, its stock of drugs and vaccines safe a while longer. Somewhere in the middle of it, Cabello came in with a thermos of coffee so strong it could probably have stripped paint from the walls. They all drank anyway. Time became a strange, elastic thing, long stretched where nothing seemed to change, punctuated by sudden spikes of fear when a cub's breathing hitched, or a monitor beeped irregularly, or the lights dimmed under another gust. Toward dawn, Nala's heartbeat settled into a more regular rhythm. Her gums, when Lena pressed them, were still pale, but a little less ghostly. Her brother, Rowan, as Lena had begun to call him under her breath, had ridden the night out with fewer convulsions, though he had his own stretches of shallow, worrying breaths. "They're not out of the woods," Cebu said at last, rubbing his eyes. "But their bodies are still fighting. That's all we can ask for right now." Ethan sat back on the low stool between the two crates, shoulders slumped, the muscles in his neck burning. He looked from one small, sleeping shape to the other. The IV bags above them dripped on, one slow beat at a time, like a patient clock ticking away the toxic hours. He thought of all the nights he'd once spent on that hunting camp veranda, listening to men talk about retirement planning, credit card rewards, and which home insurance policy protected their vacation houses. None of them had ever stayed up all night like this, watching whether a lion lived or died on a clinic floor that smelled of antiseptic and dust. Maybe, he thought, this was the bill finally coming due, not in dollars and cents, not in legal fees or court settlements, but in sleepless hours and a heart that had learned, far too late, how much a small, battered life could matter. He reached out, laying one hand on the side of Nala's crate, the other on Rowan's, feeling the faint, uneven warmth through plastic and blanket and fur. "Hang on, kids," he murmured. "I can't fix what I did before I met you, but I can stand here with you now. That's all I've got left to pay with." Outside, the storm finally began to move on, the wind dropping to a tired whisper. Inside, under the fading hum of the generator and the slow drip of IV lines, two poisoned cubs and one haunted man waited together for morning and for whatever came after. By the time the first hard edge of winter brushed the Kalahari, the clinic felt less like an emergency room and more like a nursery that had outgrown its walls. The crisis days were over, the IV lines were gone, the seizure meds pushed to the back of the cabinet, and the generator no longer sounded like the only thing holding the world together. Nal and Rowan had moved outside to a big, rough-fenced yard behind the station. Someone years ago had welded heavy pipe into a square, sunk it deep, then stretched mesh between the posts. Ethan had helped patch the holes and shore up the corners. He knew from long experience that if a lion wanted out badly enough, it would find a way. But for now, the fence was enough to keep two growing cubs mostly contained and mostly out of trouble. They'd filled the yard with what they could find: a couple of sun-bleached logs for scratching and climbing, a flat slab of rock that warmed by noon, an old tractor tire, and a battered plastic water trough that doubled as a toy. Lena hid chunks of meat in hollow logs, under stones wherever she could tuck them to make mealtime more of a hunt than a handout. Ethan spent more time at that fence than he did in his own bed. Some mornings he'd stand there with a mug of coffee, watching the cubs stalk guinea fowl shadows and pounce on each other with clumsy grace. Other days he'd sit on an upturned bucket just outside the mesh, knees drawn up, arms draped over them, talking softly as if the lions were old friends who needed catching up. Nala had grown into her name. She moved with a kind of quiet confidence that reminded him of certain women he'd known in his life. His mother, his first boss, a nurse who had once looked him in the eye in a stateside emergency room and told him bluntly to quit smoking unless he wanted to test his health insurance lifetime limits early. Nala was careful, watchful, staying back while Rowan charged ahead, but when she committed to something, a leap, a game, a challenge, she went all in. She also had a habit now. Every time Ethan came to the fence, she would circle wide around him, tail flicking, as if pretending not to care. Then, when he looked away, she'd come up behind, slip her head between the wire and his back, and bump him just hard enough to rock him forward. After that, she would trot off as if nothing had happened, eyes bright, a lioness version of a grin. Rowan was less subtle. He'd grown into a lanky, long-legged adolescent with paws a little too big for his body, and a mind that seemed to operate on the principle of, what happens if I bite this? He chewed through a garden hose, shredded 2 of Cabilo's hats, and once managed to hook his teeth through the mesh and yank Lena's stethoscope right out of her hand. "That one's going to cost me more than any car insurance premium," she'd said dryly, retrieving the chewed instrument. "If he gets into the pharmacy cabinet, I may have to take out life insurance on all of us." Ethan laughed, but there was always that little pull in his chest when he watched Rowan test the fence, every muscle saying he belonged somewhere beyond it. One late afternoon, as the sky turned the color of old copper and the wind settled, Ethan walked down to the yard with a pail of water and a bag of meat. He'd barely reached the gate when a shrill, excited yip cut the air. On the far edge of the compound, a pack of village dogs had slipped under the outer fence, drawn by the smell of blood and something wild they didn't understand. The dogs weren't big, but there were 6 of them, all ribs, teeth, and noise. They bunched near the lion yard, hackles raised, barking and growling at the strange shapes pacing behind the mesh. Rowan responded first, charging the fence with a roar that surprised even himself, claws scraping the posts. Nala followed, not as loud, but with a low, steady rumble that vibrated in Ethan's chest. "Hey!" Cabilo shouted, running from the workshop with a stick in hand. "Get out of here!" Ethan didn't think. He dropped the pail and stepped between the dogs and the fence, arms spread, voice booming in a way he hadn't used since he was a much younger man, breaking up drunken arguments in hunting camps. "Go on," he barked. "Get, before I tan your mangy hides." The dogs hesitated. One snapped at the air near his boot. Instinctively, Nala darted sideways along the fence until she was directly behind him. When one of the braver dogs lunged again, she pressed her body against the mesh, head low, eyes fixed not on the dogs, but on the space where Ethan stood. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like she was ready to spring past him. Ethan knew better. She was lining herself up behind him, using his shape as a shield, ears flicking back toward his voice. Rowan, breath heaving, slowed his charge, pacing in a tight circle, torn between fight and the strange urge to stick close to the older man who had been there from the ramp onward. Cabello arrived, swinging the stick, and the dogs finally broke, scattering in a spray of dust and yelps. They slipped back under the outer fence and disappeared into the scrub, their courage evaporating as quickly as it had flared. "You're crazin'," Cabello panted, leaning on the stick. "Standing there like that. You don't even have good medical insurance out here." "Didn't have it back home either," Ethan said, trying to slow his breathing. "Guess some of us just never learn." He turned to the fence. Nala stayed pressed against it for a moment longer, her breath puffing warm through the mesh onto his shirt. Then she stepped back, lifted her head, and gave him a look that, in another species, would have been a clear, scolding, "What were you thinking?" "Yeah, I know," he said quietly. "We're even now. I watched your back, you watch mine." Later that week, the station got visitors of a different sort. The shiny white SUV rolled up at noon, air conditioning humming, tires barely dusty. Two men climbed out, both in pressed shirts and sunglasses, carrying briefcases that didn't belong in the Kalahari. "Corporate," Lena murmured, wiping her hands on a rag. "This should be good." They introduced themselves as representatives of the agricultural company that leased much of the grazing land around the station. Their smiles were tight, their voices smooth. They talked about partnership opportunities and community investment, and about how concerned their company was with wildlife conservation and public relations. "We understand you've had an incident," one of them said, glancing toward the clinic. "A poisoned carcass, some lions affected. Very unfortunate. Our insurance department is reviewing everything." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. "Unfortunate is one word for it." The man gave a thin laugh. "Well, our legal team prefers that to negligent, but here's what we're thinking." He flipped open his briefcase, slid a folder onto the table. "We would be willing to fund a new enclosure at a safari park across the border. A nice, safe place where these two cubs can live out their days as ambassadors. Educational programs, guided tours, maybe even a little media attention. Great for awareness, great for tourism, great for everyone's brand." Lena's eyes hardened. "And in return?" "In return," the second man said, choosing his words with the care of someone who'd spent time with a corporate attorney, "we would appreciate it if any discussion of poison remained local. No need for a big lawsuit or bad press, no need for an environmental lawyer to get involved. These things can be handled quietly, with dignity. We all have mortgages, retirement plans, families to feed. There's no advantage in making enemies when we could be partners instead." Ethan thought of Nala's paw on his forearm, of Rowan's tremors, of long nights listening to shallow breaths and wondering if dawn would find them cold. "So your idea of fixing this," he said slowly, "is to lock them up in a fancy cage for the rest of their lives so tourists can take pictures and pretend the poison never happened." "That's a crude way to put it," the first man replied. "We prefer to think of it as responsible risk management. You have to admit, from a business and insurance standpoint," Lena cut him off, "from a living, breathing standpoint, it's a bad joke." The meeting ended with more tight smiles and colder eyes. By the time the SUV rolled back through the gate, leaving a trail of dust and paperwork promises behind it, Ethan's head hurt in a way no aspirin was going to touch. That night, after checking on the cubs and walking the fence, lined twice, he finally sat down at the old computer in the office, the one that wheezed when it connected to the satellite internet. There, in his inbox, he found a new message from a name he hadn't seen in years. Emily Cole. His daughter's email was short, clipped, but every word landed heavy. She'd heard from a colleague about poisoning cases in their region. She was building a case against that same agricultural company, representing local communities and wildlife groups who'd had enough. "Dad," she wrote, "I know this is a lot to ask after so long, but you're on the ground there. If you have photos, notes, anything about poisoned bait and affected lions, it could help. We're trying to stop this before more animals die. I'm not asking you as a father right now. I'm asking as someone who knows exactly what you used to do and what you might want to fix before it's too late." He sat a long time staring at the screen, the glow turning his lined face a ghostly color. Outside he could hear Nala and Rowan settling for the night, claws scraping softly on rock, a huff, a sigh. Somewhere far off a hyena laughed. There it was, he thought, 2 paths laid out in front of him. One led to a tidy enclosure with corporate logos and insurance riders and a neat, quiet story about rescued lions. The other led into a fight with men who had more money, more lawyers, more everything than he did. But maybe one thing less. He laid his fingers on the keyboard, aching knuckles and all, and began to type a reply. The wild valley lay a few miles east of the station, a shallow bowl of land scooped out between low ridges and stitched with thorn scrub and patches of grass. From above, on a clear day, it looked almost tidy, a natural arena with rock walls on 2 sides, a strand of electric fence closing the third, and open country slipping away beyond. On the ground, it was anything but tidy. Hoof prints crisscrossed the dust. Burrows pocked the slopes. The wind carried 100 different smells: antelope, warthog, jackal, old rain. Ethan stood at the gate, one hand on the metal bar, watching dust puff under the tires of the truck that had just brought Nala and Rowan out from the yard. They were bigger now, paws making heavier thuds when they jumped down the ramp. The cubs he had carried, wrapped in blankets, were gone. In their place were 2 young lions just beginning to realize the reach of their own bodies. Lena hopped out of the cab, stretching her back. "You sure your knees are up for this?" she asked. "Too late to ask," Ethan said. "We're already here." They had spent weeks arguing with the foundation that funded the station and with the company men who wanted Nala and Rowan in a tourist park. Ethan's inbox had filled with emails from Emily, full of legal language, case citations, and the kind of careful phrasing you'd expect from a good attorney trying to close every loophole before the other side's corporate lawyer could exploit it. In one late-night call, her face grainy on the laptop screen, she'd said, "If you can demonstrate that those lions are fit for release, that they can hunt, avoid people, survive on their own, that's evidence, Dad." It undercuts their whole narrative that the only safe option is captivity. It helps my case, and more importantly, it helps the next lions they try this with. He'd nodded, feeling the oddness of sitting in a small office in Africa discussing estate planning, environmental law, and wildlife management with the daughter who used to ask him to read bedtime stories. Life had a way of circling back on itself, but never quite along the route you expected. Now the plan they'd won grudging approval for had a name on paper: Controlled Pre-Release Behavioral Assessment. On the ground, it was simpler. Put 2 young lions in a big, semi-wild valley, give them less and less help, and see if their instincts woke up in time. The gate creaked open. Nala stepped through first, tail low but not tucked, nose twitching. The world beyond the fence hit her all at once: grass, wind, dung, a faint, sweet whiff of something hoofed and nervous somewhere upwind. Rowan followed, shoulders rolling like a teenager who wasn't sure whether to swagger or bolt. "For the first week," Lena said, "we'll still bring meat, smaller portions, and we'll make them work for it. After that, we taper off. No handouts, no easy meals. If they don't learn to hunt here, they won't learn out there." Ethan watched Nala stop beside a scrubby bush, flatten herself, and stare at a line of guinea fowl scratching near a rock. His chest tightened. "And if they don't learn, what then?" "Then we make hard choices," she said quietly. "But we're not there yet. Let's see what they show us." The first days felt like watching kids on a playground built by nature and indifference. Nala and Rowan chased each other through the waist-high grass, tumbled down a sandy slope, and discovered that warthogs can spin faster than they look. The first time Rowan tried to stalk one, he got too close, too fast. The warthog whirled, tusks flashing, and charged. Rowan went tail over ears in a spray of dust, yelping in a way no self-respecting lion ever wanted recorded. From their perch on the ridge, Ethan and Cabello both winced. "That'll teach him about respecting other people's property," Cabello muttered. "I've seen debt collectors less scary than a mad warthog." Nala learned faster. She watched, waited, and tried again at dusk, easing along a line of rocks until she was downwind of a small herd of springbok. Her belly hugged the ground, her tail barely twitched. She crept, froze, inched forward, eyes locked on a yearling that had drifted a little too far from the others. She didn't make a kill that night, but she came close enough that the springboks scattered in real alarm, not the lazy half-hop they gave for jackals and shadows. When she trotted back to where Ethan stood outside the fence, there was a new kind of light in her eyes, something that said, "I almost had it." Every few days they'd drive close to the fence with a covered bucket in the back. The first times, Rowan bolted to meet them, head thrown up, nostrils flaring at the smell of meat. Nala followed at a slower pace, watching both the truck and the terrain behind it, as if she were already learning to read the bigger picture beyond immediate reward. Lena made it harder. She tucked chunks of meat under rocks, up in low branches, in hollows where the lions had to climb or dig. "Make them work," she said. "We're weaning them off the idea that food drops from the sky on a schedule. No more easy food delivery service. This isn't a streaming subscription. This is life and death." One afternoon, a line of hyenas showed up at the far side of the valley, drawn by the smell of old bones and young lions. They paced outside the fence, shoulders sloped, laughter rattling through the dry air. Nala froze on a rise, watching them with a narrow, calculating stare. Rowan puffed himself up and marched closer than Ethan liked, rumbling low. "Don't be stupid," Ethan muttered, fingers gripping the fence wire. For a moment it looked like things would go bad. Rowan too near, the hyenas too bold. Then Nala moved sideways, putting herself between her brother and the threat, body angled, head high. She didn't charge. She stood, tail out, showing herself big and calm and there. After a long standoff, the hyenas melted away, more bored than defeated. "She's learning rules nobody teaches in law school," Ethan said quietly. "Stand your ground when you have to. Don't waste energy on fights you can't win." Emily could put that in a closing argument. Days turned into weeks. The meat portions shrank. The fresh carcasses Nala and Rowan dragged into the shade grew more frequent. A young impala, then a warthog piglet, then a springbok that had misjudged a leap. One evening, the sky bruised with clouds and the air heavy with the promise of rare rain, Ethan rode out with Lena for what she called the real test. In the back of the truck sat a metal pail half full of goat meat covered with a rag. It smelled rich and wrong in this wild place, a reminder of the yard and the clinic and all the human hands that had kept those lions alive. "If they come straight for the bucket," Lena said as they rolled to a stop near the fence, "it means they're still thinking of us as the grocery store. If they ignore it for what's moving on the hillside—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. They climbed down, the old habits falling into place. Ethan scanning the ground for tracks, Lena watching the wind and the shadows. Nala and Rowan appeared on a low slope across the valley, silhouettes against the darkening sky. They paused when they spotted the truck, ears pricked, the faintest ripple of recognition passing through their bodies. Rowan took a few steps down toward them, the way he always used to when the smell of meat hit him. Nala stayed where she was, head tilted, nostrils flaring. Ethan could almost see the calculations moving behind her eyes. He walked to the fence, set the pail just inside, and stepped back. The scent drifted on the cooling air, thick and familiar. "Come on, kids," he murmured under his breath. "Show us who you are now." For a long moment nothing happened. The valley held its breath. Then Nala lifted her head higher and turned it slightly to the side. Somewhere upwind, beyond the truck, a small herd of springbok picked their way along the ridge, hooves clicking on stone. The wind shifted, carrying their smell down like a subtle invitation. Nala's ears flicked. Her eyes left the pale and locked onto the moving dots of white and tan. Without so much as a glance back at the fence, she stepped away from the truck's scent, muscles flattening, body sliding back into that patient, calculating stalk. Rowan hesitated, torn between history and instinct. He looked from the bucket to his sister, tail twitching. Then, slowly, he followed her, paws placing themselves where hers had just been, leaving the promise of easy meat behind without a second look. Ethan felt something in his chest, pulled tight, then let go. Pride and loss tangled together so sharply he had to grip the fence to steady himself. "There it is," Lena said softly beside him. They chose the hunt over the handout. He nodded, throat too thick for words. All at once he understood what it meant for parents back home when kids left steady jobs to chase some wild dream across the country, when they traded predictable salaries and retirement accounts for something riskier but more true. It hurt, but trying to stop them would have hurt worse. In the fading light, two young lions slipped into the grass, golden bodies melting into a landscape that had been waiting for their kind long before any hunting camp, any poison bait, any lawsuit, or any man named Ethan Cole ever touched it. He left the pail where it was, untouched, and walked back to the truck with Lena. Behind them, the valley swallowed their footsteps, and ahead of them, though they couldn't see it yet, lay a gate that would have to open all the way one day soon. The decision, when it finally came, arrived in the form of a video call that made the little office feel even smaller. The laptop sat on the desk between Lena and Ethan, its fan whirring like a tired insect. On the screen were 3 faces in 3 different time zones. A foundation director in London, a conservation officer in Johannesburg, and a company representative whose suit looked too expensive for the bandwidth they were sharing. Emily's face sat in a small window off to the side, like a quiet witness. Her hair was pulled back, glasses perched low on her nose, the background behind her all law. Books and neat files, the way you'd expect from a good attorney who spent her days thinking about insurance claims, liability, and what judges might do. "We've all read the reports," the director said, voice crisp through the static. "The behavioral data from the valley, the hunting records, the avoidance of human scent. The lions have demonstrated a capacity for independent survival." The company man cleared his throat. With respect, that's one interpretation. A controlled safari environment still offers the safest option. From a risk management standpoint, from a public safety standpoint, from a don't sue us standpoint, Emily cut in, her voice calm but edged. "We've also reviewed your internal emails about poison bait, and your liability coverage doesn't look nearly as bulletproof as you think. If this goes to court, your shareholders are going to learn the difference between good public relations and actual responsibility. A clean release of these lions, backed by science, is your best chance to start putting this behind you." Ethan watched the man's jaw tighten. He'd seen that look before on clients who realized the hunting trip they'd booked might cost more than any travel insurance policy could cover. The Johannesburg officer leaned forward. "Our team has gone over the telemetry and the field notes. We agree with Dr. Morales and Dr. Dlamini. If these lions stay in captivity now, it's not because they can't be wild. It's because we're afraid to let them be. That's not conservation. That's fear dressed up as safety." Silence settled for a moment, broken only by the faint hum of the laptop and the distant call of a dove outside the window. "Very well," the director said at last. "On behalf of the Foundation, I support a hard release. The collars stay on for a monitoring period of 12 months. After that, We reassess. Agreed?" One by one, the faces on the screen nodded, some more grudgingly than others. The company man looked as if he'd bitten into something sour, but he nodded too. Lawyers, Ethan thought, could move mountains when they had the right rocks to throw. For once, he was grateful for every hour Emily had spent buried in case law instead of doing what he'd once wished for her: safe office job, steady paycheck, good health insurance, a neat little retirement plan. When the call ended, the office seemed to exhale. Lena leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. "Well," she said, "we just talked a lot of smart people into letting 2 lions decide their own fate." Ethan stared at the black screen where the meeting had been. "Now we have to follow through," he said. "No fences, no safety net, no tidy story with a viewing platform and a gift shop." The preparations took days, though the actual act of release would come down to a single gate and a single night. Cebu brought out the GPS collars, solid gray things that looked awkward, and foreign against the sleek lines of Nala and Rowan's necks. The lions hated them at first, scratching and twisting, trying to work their paws under the straps. "They'll get used to it," Cebu said. "Think of it like a seatbelt, mildly annoying, occasionally life-saving. Your car insurance company loves those." Ethan snorted, but his eyes stayed on Nala. She stood very still once the collar settled, head high, as if understanding, in some distant animal way, that this was the last human thing they would put on her. The day of the release dawned too bright and too normal. The sky was a wide, unblemished blue. The wind was calm. Warthogs trotted along their usual paths, and a few springbok grazed unconcerned near the far fence. It felt wrong somehow to have such an ordinary day brushing shoulders with a moment that would split Ethan's life into before and after. They waited for dark. That was the plan: open the far gate of the valley after sunset, when the air cooled and most animals began to move. Give Nala and Rowan the choice to leave under cover of night, following scents and instincts instead of the familiar shape of the fence. As the sun slid behind the ridges, painting the world in copper and then in shadow, Ethan climbed into the passenger seat of the old Toyota. Cabello took the wheel. Lena and Cebu loaded a small kit into the back, just in case something went wrong, though none of them said it out loud. "You're sure you don't want to be at the gate?" Lena asked Ethan quietly as they bumped along the track. "If I'm at the gate, they'll come to me," he replied. "That's what we taught them. Food comes with the truck, with my voice, with this old hat. Tonight, they need to listen to something older than all that. I'll watch from up top." They parked on a low rise overlooking the valley, lights off, engine ticking as it cooled. In the distance, a second truck moved along the fence line, a small rectangle of motion that would end at the gate mechanism. The night wrapped around them, warm and deep. Stars began to appear, shy at first, then in crowds. The valley below turned into a patchwork of shadow and faint silver, where stones and pale grasses caught the light. Through the binoculars, Ethan found Nala and Rowan near the center of the bowl, shapes just a shade darker than the ground. They were lying side by side, heads up, ears tuned toward sounds he couldn't hear. The collars around their necks caught the starlight, thin lines of metal on wild bodies. The radio crackled softly. "At the gate," a voice said. "Ready when you are." Lena lifted the handset, her fingers steady. "Go ahead," she answered. "Open it." Even from this distance, Ethan could see the line of fence shift at the far edge, a narrow slice of dark becoming a doorway to deeper dark. There was no trumpet fanfare, no drum roll, just a quiet widening of possibility. He watched Nala's head turn. She had felt something. New current in the wind, a faint change in the electric hum of the fence. She got to her feet, shoulders rolling, tail low, but not tucked. Rowan followed a heartbeat later, shaking out his mane, still more promise than presence. "Come on, kids," Ethan whispered, though no one but the truck's dashboard could hear him. They walked, not ran, toward the open place. Every few yards, Nala stopped, tasting the air. She looked back once, not toward the truck on the hill, but toward the center of the valley that had been their whole world for weeks. At the gate, she paused. The opening was just wide enough for a lion to slip through without brushing the wire. Beyond it lay scrub, dry stream beds, and eventually a patchwork of cattle farms and communal land that would bring them into uneasy contact with the same human stories that had almost killed them before they learned to hunt. Rowan nudged her shoulder, restless. His tail flicked, tapping her hind leg. Ethan held his breath. A part of him, the selfish, frightened part that sounded suspiciously like the voice that had once told him to stay on the safe path back in Texas. Steady job, home insurance, Medicare, nothing wilder than a fishing trip, wanted to shout down into the valley, to call their names, to slam the gate shut, to keep them safe where he could watch them. But safety, he knew now, had a cost. A life where nothing could hurt you was also a life where nothing could fully live. Nala stepped forward. For a moment her body was framed perfectly in the gap, every line of her etched in starlight. Then she was through, paws landing on ground that did not belong to any fence or plan. Rowan slipped after her, a shadow following a shadow. They didn't look back, not once. Not at the valley, not at the trucks, not at the man who sat on a hill with his hands clenched so hard around a pair of binoculars that his knuckles went white. Something in Ethan broke and rearranged itself as he watched their tails vanish into the scrub. It wasn't the shattering of loss he'd felt when the hunted lions of his past dropped to a gunshot and never rose again. It was something quieter, but no less sharp. The ache of loving something enough to set it entirely free, knowing it might never cross your path again. Beside him, Cabela murmured, "There they go." "Yeah," Ethan said. His voice came out rough. "There they go." The radio crackled again with routine words, gate secure, valley emptying, monitoring systems online. They were the language of procedures, reports, things that would be written up and filed. None of them quite captured what had just happened in the space between a lion's paw and the edge of a fence. As they drove back toward the station, the headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the dark, Ethan kept seeing that slice of night where Nala had stood for just an instant before stepping into the rest of her life. He knew there would be danger out there, poisoned still, hidden in some carcass, guns in restless hands, the long, hard arithmetic of survival. But he also knew this. For the first time since he'd come to this land and pointed other men's rifles at its great cats, he had done something that didn't end in a wall mount or a shallow grave. He had opened a gate and stayed out of the way. Whatever came next. For Nala, for Rowan, for his daughter's lawsuit, and those polished men with their corporate insurance policies. It would unfold in a world where two lions were running free because a handful of stubborn people and one haunted old hunter had said, "Let them." The years after the gate opened seemed to fold into one another, the way pages blur when you flip quickly through a book you've already read. Seasons changed over the Kalahari in small, stubborn ways. Dust storms, brief rains, the slow march of thorn trees growing a little taller along dry riverbeds. Ethan stayed on at the station for a while, helping with surveys, fixing fences, walking new volunteers out to the wild valley and telling them what had happened there. The GPS collars pinged their little signals to a computer in the office, and Lena would point out the tracks on the screen. "See," she'd say, "they're moving with the herds, avoiding villages, doing what lions are supposed to do." Sometimes the dots came close to cattle posts or crooked roads. Those nights, Ethan would lie awake on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling fan and thinking about poison and bullets and the thin line between a lion being wildlife and being problem animal. It felt a little like watching someone you love drive an old truck with no airbags down a busy highway. You prayed, and you hoped the other drivers had good brakes and better sense. News from the outside world kept arriving in the glow of the computer screen. Emily's emails grew less stiff, more like the messages he remembered from when she was younger, still precise, still full of legal terms, but threaded now with small jokes and the occasional photo. One showed her standing on the courthouse steps, hair whipped by city wind, clients beside her holding a banner about poisoned wildlife and corporate responsibility. "We reached a settlement," she wrote. "They didn't admit fault, of course. They never do. But they're funding new fencing, better grazing programs, and they agreed to end the baiting. Their liability insurance provider practically dragged them to the table once we showed them what a jury might see. It's not perfect, but it's something." In another message, she asked if he'd thought any more about his own future. "You can't stay out there forever, Dad," she typed. "I know you hate paperwork, but there are things to sort out. Social Security, maybe a little retirement planning, even a basic life insurance policy if we can get one approved. I'm not asking you to move back to the States if you don't want to. Just don't make me find out from a stranger that you were here one day and gone the next." He'd read that one twice, then sat on the clinic steps with his coffee, watching the sun climb up out of the scrub. The station felt different now. New faces, new projects, a younger crew of rangers full of energy and opinions about politics, climate change, even which credit card gave the best airline miles. He found he was repeating himself more often, old stories, old mistakes, the night under the ramp. Eventually, he told Lena, "I think it's time I got out of your way." She'd frowned, then smiled, then hugged him harder than he expected. "You're not in the way," she said, "but you're also not a fence post. You're allowed to move." He found a small room in a town an hour down the road, a faded guest house with crooked floors and a courtyard where kids kicked a ball against the wall until the owners yelled at them to stop. He started helping at the little community center, showing school children how to draw animals they'd seen only as distant shapes on the horizon. He'd trace out lions on cheap paper, big paws, heavy shoulders, and say, "They're not pets, they're not villains either, they're just trying to live their lives, same as you." In the evenings, he'd call Emily over a crackling internet line. They'd talk about small things, her car insurance premiums, his aching knees, the price of groceries. The big things, the years they'd lost, the anger she'd carried, were still there, but softer at the edges. Every now and then, Lena would drive into town and sit with him under the jacaranda tree outside a little cafe. She'd bring news from the station. "Scouts saw a lioness with a kind of arrow-shaped dark mark on her forehead," she said one day, stirring sugar into her tea. "Two cubs behind her and a male with a scar at his back leg. They were hunting by the dry riverbed." Ethan felt his heart do that old familiar lurch. "You think?" "I think it's them," she said, "doing what we hoped they'd do. No collar now, just lions." He let the picture sit in his mind. Nala grown, Rowan broader, cubs tumbling in their wake. It was enough. He told himself that, again and again. It was enough to know they were out there. Still, when the call came from the station one clear morning, Cabellow's voice on the line, brisk but threaded with something else, Ethan didn't hesitate. "We've got lion on the Ridge Road," Cabello said. "Pair of adults lying right across the track, like they own it. One has that arrow mark. You want to see something before you get too old to climb in the truck, now's your chance." An hour later, Ethan was back in the passenger seat of the old Toyota, his hands remembering the feel of the dash, his knees complaining about the familiar bumps. The land rolled past, both changed and exactly the same. New fence posts here, a cell tower in the distance there, but the sky still too big for a man to hold in his head. The Ridge Road wound up along a low rise, the kind of place tourists loved because you could see for miles. Today, the view was shorter. 50 yards ahead, the track stopped in a pool of tawny and shadow. Two lions lay in the dust, side by side, as if the world had been built around them, and not the other way around. The lioness was closest, her body relaxed, but her eyes half open, tracking the truck. A darker patch of fur on her forehead formed a shape Ethan knew as well as his own handwriting. Behind her, the male sprawled with his front legs stretched out, mane not quite full, but thick enough to ripple when the breeze caught it. A pale, puckered line traced the back of his rear leg, just where the old snare had once bitten deep. Cablo slowed, then stopped, engine idling. "We can back up," he said quietly. "Turn around. Leave them be." Ethan stared through the windshield. His heart hammered in a way no doctor would approve of, his breath catching high in his chest. "No," he said, surprising himself with how steady the word came out. "We've been backing up from things long enough." He opened the door, feeling the heat rush in, and climbed down. The air smelled of dust, old grass, and the faint, wild musk that lived in a lion's fur. He could hear the click of the cooling engine, the distant call of some small bird insisting it owned this patch of sky. The lions did not move. The lioness's eyes opened a little wider. The male's ear flicked. Ethan walked forward, slowly, hands hanging loose at his sides. He didn't raise them. He didn't try to look bigger or smaller. He knew enough now to understand that posturing didn't impress animals who had survived real danger. He stopped at what he hoped was a respectful distance, close enough to see whiskers and the individual hairs along the lioness's shoulders, far enough that if she decided this reunion was a bad idea, he might have time to regret it. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then he let the words slip out, barely louder than the breeze. "Hey, troublemakers." It was the same greeting he'd used 100 times by the yard, back when their paws were too big and their legs too short. The sound of it surprised him now, older and rougher, but somehow still his. The lioness blinked. Her ears twitched forward, then back. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring, tasting the scent that drifted off the worn shirt, the sweat, the dust, and the man inside it. Ethan watched recognition move across her face, subtle but unmistakable. The eyes that had once glared at him from under the ramp, full of hurt and fury, shifted in a way that made his throat close. She rose to her feet, slowly, as if waking from a nap she hadn't meant to take. For a heartbeat she stood there, tall and whole, the wild written into every line of her. Then she stepped toward him. Kabilo murmured something behind him, but Ithi Shan couldn't spare the attention to listen. His world narrowed to the sound of paws in dust, the whisper of breath, the soft clink of something hard against something hidden, perhaps a stone, perhaps the echo of old chains falling away. Nal stopped just behind him at first, the way she had as a cub. He felt her presence at his back before he saw her, a quiet, solid weight in the air. Then, true to old habit, she slid her head between his shoulder blades, bumping him forward with a firmness that almost took his feet out from under him. He laughed, a short, broken sound that turned into something wetter as it left his throat. "You still do that, huh?" he whispered. "Some tricks don't change." She moved around him then, slow and deliberate, as if drawing a circle that only the two of them knew how to complete. Her muzzle brushed his shoulder, then his cheek. Her breath was warm and wild and familiar. A low, deep sound rumbled out of her chest, not a growl, not quite a purr, but that strange lion chuff that lived somewhere between the two. The male came up beside them, bigger now than Ethan by nearly half again. Rowan's shoulder bumped his hip, steady as a post. He didn't rub or fawn. He simply stood there, pressed close, as if saying, in the only language he knew, "I'm here, I remember, that's enough." Ethan reached out then, because he couldn't not. His hand shook as he laid it gently against Nala's neck, fingers sinking into the thick fur where the collar had once cut a line. Her muscles tensed for only a second, then relaxed. Years ago, under a rusted ramp, he had reached out to two frightened lion cubs, and their answer had shattered his heart in a way he deserved. Now, on a dusty ridge road, he reached out to them again, and their answers shattered it all over. Only this time, the pieces seemed to fall into a shape that made more sense. They stood like that for what might have been a minute or a lifetime. No cameras, no tourists, no insurance adjuster taking notes about risk factors. Just one old man and two full-grown lions exchanging a kind of accounting no bank would ever understand. At last, Nala lifted her head and looked past him, out over the land. Somewhere out there, her cubs would be waiting, tumbling over one another, learning which shadows to fear and which to chase. She gave a soft, almost casual huff, turned and walked back toward the open horizon. Rowan stayed one heartbeat longer, leaning his weight into Ethan's hip, then followed, Mane catching the light as he went. They didn't look back. They didn't have to. Ethan watched until their shapes blurred into the same golden gray as the land, and then into nothing at all. His eyes stung and his chest hurt in that deep, bone-deep way that reminded him he was no longer young. But beneath the ache, there was a strange, steady warmth, like the low coals of a fire that had finally caught after a long, cold night. When he climbed back into the truck, Cabello glanced at him. "You okay?" he asked. Ethan let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting years to leave. "Yeah," he said, "for the first time in a long time, I think I might be." As they drove down off the ridge, the road unspooling ahead like the last few lines of a letter, Ethan thought about all the things in his life he couldn't fix. The lions he hadn't saved, the hunts he'd guided, the years he had missed with his daughter. There were no refunds for those, no policies to make them whole, but there were also two lions out there, alive, free, doing what they were meant to do, because one day a broken man had reached under a ramp instead of walking away. Because he had stayed when it was hard and let go when it was harder. For a man with his history, that felt like more than he had any right to ask for. And as the truck bumped along the ridge road, carrying him back toward town, toward phone calls with Emily, and evenings teaching children how to draw wild things they might never touch, he held that feeling close, as carefully as he'd once held the head of a trembling cub in his shaking hands. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.